Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's lesson overview for Sunday, September the 4th. This week we're going to be in Genesis 3 verses 1 through 24, and our lesson is Getting Wise on Evil. And this is a really important lesson because, right here off the bat we've had two lessons, last week on creation, this week on the issue of evil, that are really foundational to our faith, foundational to how we understand the gospel. And so even though they're pretty big issues doctrinally and theologically right here back to back, I know it may kind of make your head spin to have these two lessons back to back to teach. They really are an excellent way for us to get into the Old Testament and understand how the gospel is going to be unfolding, and how this study into the character of God is really going to help us understand why He loves us, how He loves us, the fact that He has that plan to deal with this issue of evil. But we've got to lay those foundations first before we can get into how He begins to unfold, continue to unfold His story throughout Scripture, particularly the Old Testament. When we're talking about evil, of course, several questions come up. Here's just a few of them. Are people basically born good? That's actually your table talk discussion for the lesson this week. If God created everything good, then what went wrong? Last week we talked about God created everything and God created everything good. Well, we look around us and we realize that everything is not good. So what went wrong? Where did evil come from? Why does a good God allow evil to exist? Does God do anything about evil? Now, and I can list more questions than this, but these are just some of the fundamental questions that people have when it comes to evil, and particularly evil as it relates to God. So as we're getting into this, really what I want to do is show how the gospel begins to unfold in these, in this lesson and in the lesson from last week on creation. So let's look at this a little bit. I'm actually going to be using some training material that I have from the storybook. You'll be seeing this actually later on, probably early in 2012. But I want to use some of this material because it's very appropriate for what we're talking about here. The Bible is God's story, and the story does begin there in Genesis 1:1 when we get into creation. Page by page, as the story unfolds, we begin to see that God's story is the framework of history. This, of course, deals with creation from last week. We just want to touch on this briefly, just as a recap. All of creation was made for one specific purpose, and that purpose is to glorify God. We saw that in last week's lesson. We saw how, at the beginning, Adam and Eve were in perfect harmony with God, with creation, and finally with each other. And that brings us to our lesson this week when we get into the fall. We are talking about the fall. We're talking about the day that harmony that Adam and Eve enjoyed with God, with themselves, and with creation completely unraveled. The single rule, talking there about not eating from the tree, would test their loyalty and trust in God the Creator. In rebellion, Adam and Eve decided that they, not God, would become the determiners of what is right and what is wrong. And that's ultimately what happens here in this passage as we're getting into introducing the fall, introducing sin, introducing evil into creation, into humanity. There is, of course, a fallout for the sin that happens there. Adam and Eve's relationship with God was drastically altered due to their choice. This is man's first try at religion. Every other religion is an attempt for us to craft ourselves how we want things to be as it relates to God, or as it relates to things that are spiritual, rather than looking to God Himself and trusting in Him for all that we need. Creation itself is weighed down by the fall. The fall is not just something that happened and has a dramatic effect on us as human beings, but it also has a dramatic effect on the fall itself. Creation is fundamentally different today than what it was when God created it, and that is due to the fall. That is due to our sin. It's like this ripple effect. When sin happened in this instant in time, and those ripples went out and to begin to unravel those relationships, to unravel creation from what it once was to what we see it now. Humanity and creation, of course, they are broken. They're broken spiritually, physically, socially, emotionally, and morally. When we see the effects of creation, effect of the fall rather, just walk out your door, turn on the TV, we see how these are played out in our daily lives and around the world. And the good thing is that God does not leave us in this state. We are broken and dead with no clue how to make things right. The consequences of our rebellion is the same as Adam and Eve's, an eternal separation from God. And that is where we find ourselves at the end of this chapter, in chapter 3. We find ourselves separated from God due to our sin, and we share in Adam and Eve's fate. It's not so much that sin was their problem, that evil is their problem, but it's all of humanity's problem. And when we're dealing with the gospel, when we're trying to understand salvation and what God is doing in this story and what God has done to address evil, we've got to understand the fundamental problems of evil, why it exists, and why it is so detrimental to our lives, and the fact that, yes, God does do something about evil, that God made a plan right there at the end of the chapter of how he was going to begin to deal with this problem of evil. We would kind of we hear this talked about as the proto-evangelicon. I'm butchering that word, so y'all have to excuse me. It's a big seminary word. I paid a lot of money to learn it. Didn't quite remember it. But we see this first instance of how the gospel is going to be played out throughout the rest of Scripture. You know, it's interesting. The first 3 chapters, we see creation, its perfection. We see the creation of mankind and that wonderful unity we enjoy. And we see that in 2 chapters. Then in chapter 3 of Genesis, we see it all fall apart. And then in the rest of Scripture, all the way up through Revelation, we see God fixing his creation and redeeming his creation, and we see his ultimate plan unraveling. So this brings us back to those difficult questions that I mentioned before. Now, by no means am I trying to give the all-out perfect answer to these, but I want you to see how if we look at a biblical understanding of sin and evil, that these common questions that come up that people have such difficulty with, that seem awfully tricky to us as believers, really aren't as difficult as we sometimes make them out to be. Do we understand them fully? No, we don't, but we can have a biblical answer to them. Are people basically born good? No. Because of sin, the answer to that is no. Romans chapter 3 hammers on that pretty hard. If God created everything good, then what went wrong? Well, mankind rebelled against God. This is not God's doing. It's not God's fault. It's our fault. The world is as it is because of our doing, our sin. Where did evil come from? It comes from our own sin. That's where evil comes from. Evil does not come from God. God is not the author of evil. Evil comes from us rebelling against God and choosing ourselves and our own sufficiency over God and his sovereignty in our lives. Why does a good God allow evil to exist? I think a better question is, why did mankind living in harmony with God reject him in the first place? It's not that somehow God changed and decided to introduce evil into humanity. We're the ones that decided we would step away from that relationship with God and allow evil and sin to enter into the world. Does God do anything about evil? Yes, he does. He's not idly sitting by the sidelines. And the answer to evil that we have from God is the gospel. So as you're teaching your lesson this week, as you're preparing for it, remember, we're not just isolating this issue of evil and talking about it. Let's talk about it in the greater context of Scripture and the gospel, and helping people understand that we are fundamentally talking about the beginnings of God unveiling to us his story and his plan for redemption of mankind, and that deals with this issue of evil and addressing that from the get-go, that God didn't come along later in his history and decide, well, let me fix this, it's too far gone. And, he had a plan from the get-go of Jesus, his son, coming and being our redemption and rescuing us from the evil, rescuing us from sin, and rescuing us from the wrath of God and hell. So this is important gospel foundational material here that we're getting across to our class. So as always, as you're preparing, you have questions, don't hesitate to let me know. I'll be glad to walk through some of this with you.